Welcome to Religion Off the Beaten Track with Robin Douglas, a podcast on the lesser-known aspects of religion and belief.
Hello, and welcome to the latest episode of Religion Off the Beaten Track. I'm your host, Robin Douglas, and today I'm joined by Dr Keith Kahn-Harris. Keith is a sociologist and also a writer. He's written on many subjects, including issues relating to Judaism and the Jewish community, and not long ago he published a book on language entitled The Babel Message, a love letter to language. Keith, welcome, and thanks for being with us today.
Thanks for having me on this show.
Today we're going to be talking about sacred languages, and this is a more highly charged subject than some people might expect, because language isn't just a tool, it's bound up with identity, and if you then add religion and ideas of the sacred, you have a pretty explosive mix.
You do indeed, yes. Language is often both an expression of conflict and an exacerbating factor in conflict. But the converse is also true as well, in the sense that, and this is one of the things I argue in my book, that linguistic diversity can also sometimes be something that brings us together, or at least has the potential to do so.
Okay. We're going to be focusing on sacred languages in Judaism, and most of our listeners will be aware that Hebrew is a sacred Jewish language. And there's also Aramaic, isn't there? Which is another Middle Eastern language, which is the language of most of the Talmud and other sacred writings.
Yes, that's true. Taking Hebrew first, Hebrew is the language of most, although not all of the Bible. There's a bit in the book of Daniel that's actually written in Aramaic. It's worth pointing out that the what has come down to us as a sacred, highly formal language of biblical Hebrew emerged from everyday language at some point. We're not necessarily, people still speculate on how that happened and whether the language of the Bible is how different it might have been to the language people actually spoke. My own personal view is that it's actually quite different, because the Bible is so incredibly terse. I find it hard to believe that people actually spoke like that. But all language starts with mundane purposes. It starts with things that are very fleshy and everyday and boring even. We're not exactly sure of when Hebrew stopped being a spoken rather than a liturgical or literary language, but it was certainly by the start of the Common Era, it was largely supplanted by Aramaic for daily use. That is, for Jews who lived in ancient Palestine and across the wider Middle East. And the reason for that is simply because Aramaic was the lingua franca of a large part of the Middle East. It is one of the great world languages, not so much anymore, although there's some people that still speak it. And Aramaic was used for various things, for the Targum, which is it's a kind of annotated translation of the Bible that was used in the weekly Torah readings, but also for the Talmud as well. Some of the Talmud contains multiple parts, but the heart of it is something called the Gemara. And there are two versions, the Palestinian and the Babylonian one, the Babylonian being the complete one and the one that is most usually referred to. And that was compiled and collated over several hundred years in ancient Babylonia, in what we would today call Iraq. So liturgically speaking, the majority of the Jewish liturgy is in Hebrew, but there are some things that are in Aramaic as well. The best known example of that is the prayer called Kaddish, which is used for, it's not just used for memorials to the dead, but that is its most well-known use outside the Jewish community. It's used for other things as well. But Hebrew never actually died. it even developed as well over time, as all languages do. It was particularly as the Jewish population became a diaspora spread out to multiple parts of the world. It was a language of correspondence. It was a language of poetry. It was a language of literature, occasionally for theological works or for works of Jewish law. So it's not entirely correct to say it died. And it was occasionally, if there was no better option available, was occasionally spoken, although it was quite difficult to do that. So Hebrew never died, but modern Hebrew is nonetheless a bit of a caesura in the language, in the sense that in the last part of the 19th century, biblical Hebrew in the early Zionist movement was adapted and reconstructed, if you like, to become an everyday spoken language. And that's the language that's spoken in Israel, plus quite a few Jews in the diaspora speak it as well. But it is quite different in certain respects to the language that the Bible is written in. It's grammatically, it's much more familiar to speakers of Indo-European languages. And also the vocabulary has been massively updated to take into account modern developments. And it's continued to develop because it's a living language that is spoken every day by several million people. And liturgy is, as far as I'm aware, not in modern Hebrew, although there might occasionally be poems and stuff that might be read out or sung in some particularly non-Orthodox synagogues as well. So that's quite a long explanation, but the heart of, when we're talking about liturgy, the heart of it still remains Hebrew in the more classical sense. Although, again, as a major caveat to that is in non-Orthodox Jewish movements, some prayers are said or even occasionally sung in the local vernacular as well. So in English, or where we are now.
So would it be fair to say then that in Reform and Liberal synagogues, you'd hear modern languages, but there continues to be a large element of Hebrew?
Yes, that's certainly true. I mean, Hebrew is sometimes referred to as Lashon Kodesh, the holy tongue. And throughout the Jewish world, or at least throughout the Jewish religious world, whether that's Orthodox or progressive, it's still accorded a particular status. And the most important prayers, particularly like the Shema, will still be said in it. The Torah, when it is read, will be read in the original Hebrew. In fact, it will be read from a scroll, which is quite difficult to do because there's no punctuation or vowels in those scrolls. So it still has a status, and there is still a sense, while translation is something that has always happened, translation of the Bible has always happened, and it's still an important thing to do. And it's not seen as somehow blasphemous to do it. It's not a substitute for the original. And here we come to a key difference with Christianity, in the sense that Christianity is a sort of universalist religion that seeks to speak to everybody. So the message becomes much more important than the way the message is communicated. So even in the most fundamentalist Christian denominations, you are not likely to hear the New Testament written in Greek. You're certainly not going to hear the Old Testament written in Hebrew. You might use, so in Orthodoxy, you might use Church Slavonic for certain things, which certainly has a certain status, but it isn't, quote unquote, the original. It is still a translation, albeit quite an ancient and old one, with a certain weight attached to it. But there is something in the status according to Hebrew that says that it has an intrinsic value to itself, that there is something that can only be communicated with it. And there you have, even though Islam is a universalist religion like Christianity, it is here similar to Judaism, in the sense that there isn't a substitute really for reading the Quran in classical Arabic. It's still attached to that. It still has a particular status.
Yeah, Muslims say, don't they, that English versions of the Quran aren't the Quran, or even translations of the Quran. They're just interpretations of it. So something essentially different.
Yes, and you will find some Jews who will say something similar. I think it's more that within the Jewish context that the translations are sometimes seen as okay as a way of making sure that absolutely everybody understands the text, or it can have a creative element of itself in the sense that every generation creates its new translation, and the process of doing that translation can allow you to dig into the text in interesting ways. But it's not a substitute for the original. And that status, according to Hebrew, isn't so much that it can express things that no other language can, although perhaps some might make that sort of quasi-theological claim. It's more that the way it is expressed, the Bible is expressed, it's not an accident, if you like. So there is, for example, an ancient Jewish tradition called Midrash, which it's quite a complicated kind of literature, but a significant part of Midrash is devoted to explicating what isn't said, if you like, or what is puzzling in the Torah. And one of the key principles there is that there are no mistakes, right? If there is something that is puzzling or you can't understand what it's saying, that is not because it's not clear. It's because it requires a deeper or more complex level of midrashic explication. There's also the Kabbalistic tradition, the mystical tradition, where letters are not just simply instrumental means of forming words, which are instrumental means of describing the world. They have an intrinsic value to themselves. They have intrinsic meaning to themselves. And the way that the Bible is written has mystical significance. So that means that translation, while it can be valuable for many things, is a kind of different act to actually engaging with the text itself. And even I shouldn't say even, because I am a progressive Jew myself, but even within progressive Jewry, there is still very much a sense that the Hebrew text means something that cannot necessarily be replaced. So, whilst progressive Jews have often revised the liturgy very radically, or added to it, or done things like make the language more inclusive, you will still read Torah in Hebrew. You may read a shorter portion of it on the weekly basis than Orthodox synagogues would do, but you still read from the scroll as in other denominations do. There is still a rootedness in Hebrew there.
Yeah, and as you say, there's a real contrast there with the way that the Christian churches have gone in recent times, because sacred languages and dialects have become de-emphasized within Christianity. Within the Church of England, you won't often attend a service which is celebrated according to the 17th century Book of Common Prayer. And within Catholicism, you will rarely come across a Latin Mass. And there are groups of people who are attached to those older forms, but they are subcultures. And people who are attached to those older forms of language, those sacred forms of language, are seen as being a bit eccentric and often would be extremely conservative. But it seems that within Judaism, there's a much broader and a much less selective attachment to Hebrew.
Yes, and it's also true that any kind of serious study, Jewish study, usually involves engagements with the text in the original in some form. So I teach at a progressive rabbinic seminary, and people will come to be ordained starting from usually, although not always, having much less facility with the text than might be the case when Orthodox people study for ordination. But what we spend a huge part of the 5 years is getting people's language skills up to date. So that means Hebrew, obviously. It also means Aramaic. It can sometimes even mean different versions of Aramaic or different kinds of Hebrew. And we also have this very complicated task, is that it's quite common for people to come to the seminary knowing modern Hebrew, but not having very good biblical Hebrew. And they have to do this sort of quite complex, almost unlearning. I'm personally someone with pretty good modern Hebrew, and biblical Hebrew sometimes feels a bit alien to that. So studying the original is still crucial in Jewish life. A difference with Islam is that in Islam there's a very strong tradition of memorizing the Quran and celebrating those who've done that. That's not to say it doesn't happen, but it rarely happens as an end in itself. You will see it particularly within the strictly Orthodox world. You will have particular geniuses celebrated who basically know the whole Bible, or maybe even the whole Talmud. But that's a kind of byproduct of their deep engagement with the text, rather than what they were trying to set out to do in the first place.
Yeah, and going back to the Kabbalistic tradition that you referred to, there's a strand of thought, isn't there, that would attribute sacred significance even to individual words and letters and the shape and form of particular letters in the Hebrew.
Yes, there is. It's not something that I'm an expert on, but the best example of this, of course, is the name of God, which consists of what's known in scholarly world as the Tetragrammaton. Actually, I'm not sure I can pronounce it. It's 4 letters that could be pronounced Yehovah, but there are many different ways it could be pronounced, because some of the letters can be silent. They can be pointed in different ways with different vowels. And the true pronunciation was known only to the high priest during the times when the temple actually stood and only pronounced aloud once. So the name has a very, very powerful significance. And when it's written in a prayer book or in the Bible, it's just written as Yehovah without vowels. Prayer books usually have vowels. Book versions of the Torah will have vowels, but the scroll that we read from does not have vowels. And so it's pronounced usually a kind of euphemism. So one way of pronouncing it that you will often hear is Hashem, which means the name. But there are other ways you can pronounce as well. Another way is Adonai, which means something like my Lord. But that's actually not the name of God, right? It's almost like a euphemism for that, because it's something so sacred. Indeed, some people, when they write God in English, will put a dash instead of the O to avoid writing it. I've always seen that as, myself, is not quite in the spirit of things, because God is just a name. It's not the name. But I understand why people do something like that. So it has a powerful significance, and the sort of playing with the names of God is a Kabbalistic tradition as well. And sort of each letter has a numerical value, and they do calculations in different ways. There's pushback against that kind of tradition. There's always been from some elements of Judaism. Judaism has always been quite a contentious religion, but it certainly, particularly since about the 15th century, became a very important part of Jewish life, and was foundational also to Hasidism that emerged in the 18th century, the Jewish mystical tradition. So, yeah, that kind of playing with letters, if you like, is an important tradition.
Yeah, and mention of Kabbalistic thought gives me the chance to repeat a comment that Joseph Dan, the great scholar of Jewish mysticism, made, which was that visitors to modern Israel will see Kabbalah everywhere, because if you go into your hotel and you go to the reception, you'll see Kabbalah written over the reception, because it's the
which means reception. Yeah.
Likewise, if you go out and buy a drink in a cafe and you pay the bill, you'll get a receipt saying Kabbalah, because that's the word for receipt. And there's this strange clash of the sacred language and concept with the mundane modern context in which modern.
Well, one of the things I love about modern Hebrew is the way that it builds on and changes these more ancient traditions, sometimes in very creative ways. Probably my favorite So the modern Hebrew words, a lot of them were actually created, right? Not from nothing, but often using particular sources. And even today, there's an Academy of Hebrew Language which creates words because there are always new words that need to be created. And sometimes they take off and sometimes they don't. And sometimes just words bubble up or people use a loan word instead. So my favorite Hebrew word, which is used, is the word for to volunteer, which is lahit nadev. Now that comes from the root. I should say here that roots are very important in Hebrew, as in other Semitic languages like Arabic and Aramaic, because they have what's called a triconsonantal, or sometimes 2 or 4 consonants, that you can build multiple verbs and nouns and other words from. So lahit nadev is based on the root nadev, which stems from the biblical character Nadav. And when the children of Israel go to the Red Sea, and Moses says that God will part the sea, the children of Israel were fairly worried about it. But one brave person called Nadav went in, and I think he waded up to his nose, I think it says, before the sea actually parted. So the word in Hebrew, lahit nadev, basically means to nadav yourself. Which I've always thought is wonderful, but sometimes it doesn't really work. So the most famous example of a created word that doesn't work is, which was created by Israel Ben Yehuda, who is often knows the father of the Hebrew language, is the word for telephone, which is sachrachot. It's still the official Hebrew word, and it basically is a portmanteau term for the words for discussion or conversation, siach, and rachok, which means far. So you could call it far talker, which is quite nice, but no one uses it. They just use telephone. However, the word for mobile phone is pelephone, and that's because it was taken from one of the first mobile companies in Israel, which was called Pelephone. But Pele is a classical Hebrew word. It means wonder, so it basically means wonder phone. So you do get this very odd mixture of past and present in modern Hebrew, but that, of course, is why some of the Orthodox resistance to Zionism, which is now confined to sections of the strictly Orthodox population, is a concern at the possibilities of profanation that can create. The anti-Zionist Orthodox Jews who live in Israel, a lot of them do speak modern Hebrew because basically it's the country they're living in, and they need to have some knowledge of it, even though they prefer to use Yiddish on a daily basis. You create facts on the ground. If you live in a country where people speak Hebrew, at the very least, sections of your community are going to need to speak Hebrew too. It has an undeniable force.
You mentioned Yiddish, which leads us on to an interesting point. For most of the last 2,000 years, Jewish communities have tended to use a variety of different Jewish languages and dialects other than Hebrew for day-to-day purposes, haven't they? Yiddish being one, as well as Ladino and Judeo-Arabic.
Yes, I mean, Jews spoke across the diaspora particular versions of the vernacular, some of those Jewish vernaculars being very, very distinct to the point of incomprehensibility of the languages that were spoken around them. And those not just in the Christian world, but there are even some of them from India. There's Judeo-Malayalam. I can't remember the name of the language. And the most famous, of course, is Yiddish, because it was the lingua franca of Jews, of Ashkenazi Jews, and spoken across, certainly in Eastern Europe, large parts of the former Soviet Union, Central Europe, and even parts of Western Europe as well, and then was exported when people emigrated to places like America or Britain. And Yiddish came in many different varieties. It had particular dialects that were more or less influenced by particular local languages. It has a Germanic basis, but it also has a lot of Hebrew in it. It has elements of it from Slavic languages and even from other languages like Lithuanian and so on. And it was very vital. It had in the 19th century, a huge secular, and 20th century too, secular literature grew up in Yiddish. What happened is when Jews started emigrating from the Yiddish heartlands in the end of the 19th century, they often, not always, lost that language within a generation or two. So when it was my great grandparents that were born in Poland, and they spoke Yiddish to them between each other, but they didn't speak it to the kids. My grandmother, and my grandfather as well. They all had the same experience. They had a passive knowledge of it because it was spoken around them, but they didn't really speak it themselves. And that's something similar happened in America as well. It wasn't universal. Some people did keep it and pass it on, but this was certainly in places like Britain and in much of the modern nation states as it developed in the 19th and 20th century. Multilingualism wasn't something, unless you were an intellectual or a scientist or something, it wasn't something that was celebrated for its own sake. There was one national language for one nation. So Welsh in Britain was suppressed and officially discouraged for a very long period, right up into the 20th century. So to assimilate better, you needed to sort of drop Yiddish, really, and a lot of people did within a generation or two. But not everyone did. And within the strictly Orthodox community, it survived. And within sections of the more secular militant left, it survived as well. But the Holocaust was a catastrophe for Yiddish. It was an absolute catastrophe for Yiddish. There's no question about that. And what it meant is that the vast majority of Yiddish speakers post-war were in the strictly Orthodox community, where it is still very widely spoken, and there are even newspapers in it. But there are also Yiddish revivalists as well, often with quite a strong secularist diaspora, sometimes anti-Zionist perspective. And it's still a language that is loved and thought of sentimentally, and plenty of people use the odd Yiddish word. I certainly do. The problem with Yiddish, though, is that it sometimes overshadows other Jewish languages that also had their own traditions. So you mentioned Ladino, which is sometimes known as Judeo-Spanish or Judesmo. There's a version of it called Haketia as well. That's the language that was in 1492. The Jews of Spain and Portugal were expelled, and they developed their own diaspora in places like Turkey and Greece and in North Africa. And they continued to speak their version of Spanish, which over time became a very distinctive Jewish variant. And it had its own literature in places like Salonika, where a large percentage of the city before the Holocaust was Jewish. Again, that was wiped out in the Holocaust. Post-war immigration to Israel also, it paradoxically, it concentrated speakers of these Jewish languages in one place. So there were a lot of Judeo-Arabic speakers who came after they were expelled from Arab countries after the State of Israel was formed. And while some of those languages have survived and still spoken, it's only fairly recently in Israel that there's been much support for these languages, because the nation-building process was very much Hebrew-focused. There are lots of other ones. There's Judeo-Georgian. There are extinct versions like Judeo-Provençal. But what they are all a product of is that Jews in the pre-modern period largely lived in self-governing communities with a degree of isolation and often persecution from the wider world, whether that was Christian or Muslim or something else. And those are conditions in which ethnolects tend to thrive. I think it's only quite recently that there's been a wider effort beyond Yiddish to try and preserve and revive these other languages. And that there's an initiative that was just started just last year, 2021, the Oxford School of Rare Jewish Languages, which is trying to teach other Jewish languages beyond Yiddish.
Yeah, it's a fascinating area. And there's a lot more that could be said about Yiddish in particular and its history.
Well, oddly enough, somebody a couple of days ago forwarded to me a poem he found that was written in Scottish Yiddish. That there was a particular Scots kind of variant of Yiddish that emerged. I don't think it's still spoken, but great, the more the merrier.
Good heavens, yeah, I didn't know about that. So Yiddish these days is it does still survive, doesn't it, in Britain?
It does. It's if you go to somewhere like Stamford Hill, the language spoken on the street will often be Yiddish, amongst strictly Orthodox Jews, maybe laced with modern Hebrew or English and maybe other languages as well. There are also often secular Yiddish revivalists who are very enthusiastic as well. And in some families, unlike mine, it was actually passed down. So there were some young people who were brought up with a knowledge of it, although not a huge number.
On the subject of languages being taught to children, is it still common for Hebrew in its biblical form to be taught to Jewish kids in this country?
I think you have to make the distinction here between strictly Orthodox Jews and other Jews, including modern Orthodox Jews. Strictly Orthodox Jews will be from a very early age immersed in biblical and then Talmudic texts. But outside that, it's much more variable. The majority of Jewish kids now go to Jewish schools, and they will also, as they did before that, and even still today, Jews would go on Sunday morning and maybe another evening during the week for Jewish education, culminating in the Bar Mitzvah at age 13. And the Bar Mitzvah, you'd read from the Torah in Hebrew and maybe also lead part of the service. Obviously, in the Orthodox world, girls do not have Bar Mitzvahs in the same way as boys, although it is starting to happen that even in the Orthodox world, girls do have some kind of ceremony that does involve some kind of reading skill. So in that sense, it is normal for Jews in Britain who have any kind of institutional contact with the Jewish community, whether that's a synagogue or a school, to learn how to read Hebrew. But actually learning Hebrew beyond that is much more variable, often to the point of non-existence. So my kids, I didn't go to Jewish school, my kids do. They have learned since primary school modern Hebrew, and rather than biblical Hebrew. They have looked at Jewish texts. They have a certain degree of knowledge, but frankly, it's pretty poor. And there is not a great deal of enthusiasm for it. And that's common to almost everyone else I know, including Orthodox Jews, although not strictly Orthodox Jews. There are multiple issues here. One of them is that Britain is a kind of place where language teachers go to die. Language being taught in school, it's a real issue because we are English speakers. It's a big problem. And Hebrew is no different to that. I also think that Israel is probably the greatest nation of language teachers on earth. They got people from all over the world and taught them Hebrew within a year or two. It's an incredible achievement, but something seems to happen to Hebrew teachers when they leave Israel. And it's probably the fact that their pupils don't have the necessity to learn it, like the need to assimilate to a new society. So even though probably the majority now of Jewish children will be exposed to modern Hebrew teaching of some form at school, it is not the lingua franca of British Jews. It's not the everyday language of British Jews, other than those who have parents who are from Israel, and there are quite a lot of those, actually. There's several thousand of those at least. And as for biblical Hebrew goes, that is rarely taught. Certainly at my kids' school, which has pretty good Jewish education generally, you can't even do a biblical Hebrew GCSE. And that's quite common. It's a bit different in centrist modern orthodoxy. The levels of knowledge tends to be higher, but far from always. And so, whilst you can probably assume that most Jews who meet who've been to a synagogue or had a bar mitzvah or went to a Jewish school should be able to read Hebrew in some way, perhaps haltingly. Beyond that, you can't make any assumptions about what Jews can actually do. which is sad in my view. It's really sad in my view.
So, in the modern Jewish experience, is Hebrew bound up more with the secular language of the State of Israel as opposed to the sacred biblical language?
Yeah. Well, yes and no. Because the Hebrew that most diaspora Jews will have most contact with outside Israel, obviously, is going to be liturgical and biblical Hebrew. But the language they're taught, if they're taught, is likely to be modern Hebrew. And they may not even be taught that. So it gets really a bit confusing. And even in the strictly Orthodox world, it's quite interesting. It's rare for kids to be given sit down biblical Hebrew and Aramaic lessons. It tends to be taught by actually doing, by immersing people in these texts and learning it that way, rather than so. The seminary that I teach at, although I don't teach Hebrew there, it was founded by refugee German rabbis in the early post-war period, and had that very much vision-stuffed Enlightenment emphasis on grammar. And so it's quite often that you will find, certainly the faculty of the seminary I teach at will be much better at things like grammar than strictly Orthodox Jews might be, even though their knowledge of the text might be less encyclopedic. They were more likely to have been taught the language from the ground up. But that just tends to be rabbis and people who do advanced learning. And in fact, even in faculties of Jewish studies in this country, a lot of Jewish texts are not taught in the original at all. So real good knowledge of biblical Hebrew and Aramaic is fairly thin on the ground.
Okay. And would it be fair to say that Jewish people in this country would conceptually think of biblical liturgical Hebrew as being in a different category from modern Israeli Hebrew?
I think that people have some knowledge, even a bit of knowledge, would see it that way. I think in terms of your regular Jew on the pew, it's much less certain that they will understand the differences between them, because really you have to know one or other language to understand that the differences are actually quite substantial. And something I've seen in synagogue is sometimes we'll have Israelis who are called to read Torah, and if they haven't practiced properly, they often make a terrible mess of it because they don't really, unless they've had a proper education in it, they often surprise themselves by how different it is. But it's not as simple as saying they're mutually unintelligible, because it depends what you're talking about. And of course, biblical Hebrew is only one form of Hebrew. I've found it noticeably easier to understand later versions of literary Hebrew, like poems from the medieval period. I can understand them much, much better than I can the Bible, because the Hebrew has evolved over time. But the grammar of biblical Hebrew is very alien compared to the grammar of modern Hebrew, which for a speaker of a modern European language is a little bit less alien. It has tenses, which biblical Hebrew doesn't have tenses in the way that we would understand tenses.
Yeah. And if we look at the future of Hebrew, how would you see that evolving? I guess in part that's a political question bound up with the fortunes of Israel.
There are multiple lines of direction. One is, as Israel got bigger, as its population expanded, the emergence of particular ethnolects. And you already have that. You already have the Hebrew spoken of people who either speak Arabic or come Jews from Arab lands, or Palestinians who often speak Hebrew, particularly Palestinians of Israel. There are sort of ethnolect tendencies there, that they will use particular words or ways of pronunciation. And some of those have actually bled into language. So street Hebrew has quite a stronger Arabic influence, often sounds a bit more Arabic. The strictly Orthodox, the Haredi community, their Hebrew, if they speak it, will often be laced with Yiddish and biblical Hebrew and Aramaic and things like that. But one thing that's very interesting is that there is now a substantial proportion of Israeli-born people who have immigrated or temporarily or permanently. There is now an Israeli diaspora, which is sometimes part of the Jewish diaspora and sometimes very distinct from it. People have started to write. Those diaspora Israelis are starting to write, some of them. So there's the possibility that could create its own Hebrew. Some people have speculated on that possibility. Something I also saw today, though, is that I find absolutely fascinating is a project called it's called the Non-Binary Hebrew Project, which is trying to reform Hebrew because Hebrew is very, very heavily gendered. Almost everything has a gender, and trying to create non-binary gendered Hebrew, either for just people who are non-binary or for everybody to take gender out of the language. And they're doing some really innovative work. And if there's ever a language where it would be possible to do major surgery on, it would be Hebrew, because ultimately this was created and it was developed at an incredible pace. So you could imagine that language planning of that kind could get traction, although the odds are probably still against it. And that feeds into the liturgy as well. So the reason I heard about the Non-Binary Hebrew Project is some people have used its principles to create what's called an inclusive siddur, inclusive prayer book, that has adapted the Hebrew of the prayer book, which is not modern Hebrew for the most part, adapted it using these non-binary grammatical principles that actually come from attempts to reform modern Hebrew. So it's all quite fascinating, quite complicated, and it's very fast moving.
And you could draw parallels, I'm sure, with debates about inclusive language in other religious communities.
Yes, you could. And it's even amongst those who agree with that principle, the way you do it, there are lots of different views about how you do it. Sometimes it's just adding in something, and sometimes it's actually changing the language itself, which is a much more ambitious, but I think much more interesting way of doing it. And there will be various views on how it's done, and some will be picked up on and some will fall by the wayside, which tends to be what happens when people try to reform language.
And these things arouse strong passions. This, I guess, brings us back to the point that we started with, which is that language is something that's bound up with identity, with religion, with ideas of what is holy. And far from being just a tool that we use to communicate, it can be a highly, highly sensitive, highly difficult area and highly contentious area.
Yes, absolutely. And I find the controversy fascinating, but the approach I've taken in my book, The Babel Message, is one of love of linguistic diversity for its own sake, even for languages I don't understand. That I love even the innovations that I wouldn't necessarily want to adopt myself. I can say, wow, that's interesting. I want to have as many different ways of speaking as possible, regardless of whether I would want to speak them myself. It's like I don't want to learn Georgian because it sounds a nightmare to learn. But I love the fact that people speak Georgian with its infernal consonant clusters, which learners tear their hair out over. It's great. Vive la difference, if you like.
And indeed, in the book, you create your own language. I don't want to give away any spoilers for those who haven't read it, but you create your own language, don't you, to translate?
I do.
Yeah.
I do. And the way I did it, I used a Semitic root system. One of the things that I'm never going to make a claim that any language is superior to the other. It's a nonsensical thing to say. But it is certainly true that Hebrew and other Semitic languages do allow for a huge amount of creativity because of that root system, because you can generate new words in interesting ways from just a small number of combinations of sounds or letters. It's a really fascinating way of doing language. Also quite alien to speakers of languages like English.
Okay. So, returning to the subject of sacred language, is a sacred language just something that's been fashioned out of the material of a mundane day-to-day language?
Yeah, and we also, sacred languages also attempt to fix linguistic fluidity and take that snapshot and venerate it, which is, of course, it's absurd in one way, but also quite beautiful as well. Just taking a language in a moment of time and saying that is something to celebrate and to venerate for all time. Because how many languages did that never happen to? Whereas the language of the Bible, that's preserved. That snapshot is preserved and will be read and studied probably for an indefinite period.
As a final question, looking at the matter sociologically, why do we have sacred languages? Because there's a rather trite answer to that, which might be, well, it's to do with preserving power and prestige for a priestly class. If you elevate one form of speech that only educated people know, that helps to solidify a hierarchy. But can we go beyond that? Is there a more interesting answer to the question of why we have sacred languages?
Well, the question of why we have sacred languages is also related to the question of why we have sacredness of any kind. And actually, that's where the anthropological literature is in some ways more useful than the sociological literature. Because anthropologists, particularly structural anthropologists like Levi-Strauss or Mary Douglas, who influenced me personally quite a lot, showed how the sacred and the profane and the liminal space between the two is something that recurs across culture, and that sense of places or times that are set apart seems to be something that humans want to do because it takes them to a place that is impossible to reach in everyday life. It can be, and as much as anything, the process of crossing that boundary between sacred and profane is often thrilling. And it breaks up time as well. And in this, the anthropological literature really accords with the Jewish literature, which sees sacredness as a form of setting apart, and particularly in setting apart in time. The theologian Abraham Heschel, particularly in his work on the Sabbath, says that Jews, after the temple was destroyed, Jews didn't build sacred spaces, they built sacred time. And one of the ways that you mark out sacred time is linguistically, just as you would in a sacred space. It seems to be a common human need, and a sacred language just reinforces that, particularly when you're praying several times a day, when it brings that sacredness into the everyday in a very, if you like, efficient sort of way.
Yeah, it's interesting. It's very interesting. Unfortunately, that's all we have time for today. But we've covered a lot of ground, and you've given us a lot to think about. Dr. Keith Kahn-Harris, thanks for speaking to us.
My pleasure.
You have been listening to Religion Off the Beaten Track with Robin Douglas. Remember to follow us on Twitter and Facebook.